Hello. Welcome. This is Headlocks and Headphones. I am Martin Anderson with you for roughly an hour. This week we did have Raw, SmackDown, NXT, AEW, plus a new feature from Zoe Styles, but instead ditched all that, and we're going to have an interview with the founder of the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame, Bradley Craig, who's going to be with us for around about 45 minutes of the show. So that means it gets a little bit harder for us to add in the feature that Zoe Styles has been working on. But trust me, based on something that happened on Raw, it's something you're going to want to see. That's going to be next week, and she's going to do top three. Well, you can find out next week. Apparently, I'm not allowed to tell you. Anyway, ignoring the fact that I'm sworn to secrecy about what she's got planned, I do have some wrestling news, and of course, we are going to look at our wrestling interview this week. Bradley Craig from the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame. The first part of the interview is about 45 minutes. I'm going to tell you, I had access to him for nearly 2 hours, and some of which I'm not allowed to share. One part of which was a tour around his wrestling collection, which, by the way, for a geek like me, was incredible. So thank you to Bradley Craig for joining me. And of course, more importantly, hopefully, thank you to all of you guys for tuning in and enjoying the show. But before that, we will talk about the wrestling news. So we're not going to be covering Raw, SmackDown, AEW, and NXT today, but it would be very hard for me to focus on the big stories of this week unless we speak about NXT and AEW in some way. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is the ratings victory for NXT. There have been several weeks now where NXT have won the ratings battle, and there is some issues on the internet, especially Twitter, where Chris Jericho has been posting the fact that in fact, AEW won the demographics. Now, in terms of advertising dollars, you can look at it and say, yes, AEW won the demographic battle. They won the demographic that spends the most money as far as advertisers are concerned. So there's a very big victory for AEW there. However, NXT have for several weeks now had more people watching their show. So the interesting point here is that people are interested in the product that NXT are putting on. Similarly, people are also interested in the product that AEW are putting on. So there's no issue here with the products being horrible. I think in recent weeks we have seen people heading more towards NXT than AEW, as the AEW product's not quite been as consistent as it has been. I'm not saying it's been horrible, but there's been some issues with the AEW product. There's been some stuff that seems almost thrown together. Now, I know they always say, oh yeah, but you have to think about the long-term story. The problem here is I think AEW is still a little bit too lacking in direction. NXT, on the other hand, is hyper-focused on direction to the point where they're actually overbooking these shows, and they're actually what's called hot-shotting. They're throwing so much to get these victories that they're giving away stuff that could potentially make money down the line. Something that every wrestling company does at some point, usually to get through a small ratings hurdle, which can actually help you. Now, the USA Network were so interested in getting that victory this week that they actually had limited advertising during the show, which allowed them to continuously have the fans tuned into the product, and it saved them from flicking backwards and forwards during the adverts. A lot of networks in America, they try and time the adverts to be slightly different so that people don't have the ability to flick backwards and forwards. There's entire teams designed towards figuring out how to prevent people from leaving your product and heading somewhere else. And not just for wrestling. This is for every product. CSI and all that lot, they have the same thing. It's about maintaining the audience during the shows. So NXT, for me, have been the product that have managed that in recent weeks. The fact the USA Network have actually been confident enough to reduce the amount of adverts and stick with the product shows that they see some qualities there. Interestingly, though, there are reports that the USA Network in America have actually made some demands about certain changes in recent weeks, one of which would have been the main event for Night 2, which was all the gold on the line. The NXT Championship, the North American Championship, all on the line at the same time. And one of the things that's quite interesting here is either guy wins, Keith Lee or Adam Cole, either guy wins, you're going to be a happy bunny. But this was one of those shows where we saw Keith Lee walk out with both belts, and the rumors are that Adam Cole and his Undisputed Era buddies are going to show up on Raw or SmackDown in the coming weeks, which should be interesting. Bear in mind, they're pre-taping everything and nothing's came out as a spoiler for these guys debuting. Either they're recording something today to air on tonight's show, or we won't be having them on SmackDown this week. But either way, it looks like the Undisputed Era are finished with NXT, and it also looks like Keith Lee holds all the gold. Now, talking of gold, anybody out there fan of belts? I've got 30 plus of them floating around the house. I've got a Bret Hart one. I've got a Zelda one. I've got, what else have I got? I've got a 24/7 title. I've got a handful of minis. My son's got his own one. I'm a big belt fan. I love belts. So on AEW this week, it was cool that Taz actually brought out his belt. And by his belt, I don't mean a belt that he just had made. I mean a belt that he had made and used on ECW television. One that never belonged to ECW. It was always his belt, which means that he could still use it on AEW. The FTW belt. I'll let you figure out what the F stands for, but TW stands for the world. Now, Brian Cage, somebody who, he's got a Wolverine appearance for me, and he's somebody that a lot of people like, but not somebody that I think is ever going to be the top guy in a top drawing company. But this is where that could change. I think every talent needs a moment to show you that something is possible. And being handed the FTW belt turns next week's Fyter Fest into, not Fyter Fest, this week was Fyter Fest, it's Fight for the Fallen. There's too many fights. So next week is going to be Brian Cage, FTW champion, versus Jon Moxley, AEW champion. Now for me, with the push that you give him Brian Cage, it makes the most sense for him to walk away with both belts. It kind of almost is a repetition of what we've just seen with Keith Lee. But at the same time, what's really interesting is I'm not sure if the idea for this belt was always there, or if belt maker Dan McMahon somehow kind of inspired this idea. Now, to be clear, I don't think Dan McMahon works for AEW, and I don't think AEW is taking ideas from him, but he only this past couple of weeks finished FTW belt that he bought from Jamar, who had the license from Taz to make the FTW replicas that they plan to sell. Now, the belt that Dan McMahon bought had badly damaged plates, which took quite a long time to fix. So several years later, after buying them, he's been able to fix them up and been able to get them put onto some leather. And as he's done that, it happens to coincide with when Taz brings it out. Maybe it didn't inspire the story, but certainly you would have to assume it's very coincidental. A belt maker finishes his copy of the belt, and Taz suddenly decides to bring the belt back to air. So it's a rather interesting one there, showing that AEW perhaps influenced by things that are going on around them. And that's not a bad thing, that's a positive. Now, one of the interesting things, because we're not talking about Raw, we're not talking about SmackDown, we're not talking about AEW and NXT in any real depth this week. We're not going to talk about the overhyped match that was Chris Jericho versus Orange Cassidy, which, you know, Jericho labeled as being the best match of his career, and I'm sorry, but it wasn't even his best match in AEW, but we won't go down that route too far. Let's bring up some stories from the past. Now, Arn Anderson on his podcast was just talking about the death of WCW, or at least his perception of what. And one of the interesting things that I did see was that he was talking about the fact when he knew WCW was going to be ending. And one of the things that's quite interesting is, obviously, you could see things were taking a negative turn when you saw the developmental guys and the power plant guys were filling up the roster, and all the expensive guys were getting sent home. But Arn would go on to tell a story that, for me, kind of sums it up. Now, he was at the MGM Grand, and it was a venue that WCW ran quite a lot. It's a venue that AEW have run since. But one of the ways that Arn could see that the business was going to fail was the fact that he was coming down the elevator, and as the elevator door opened, he heard lots of laughter. And he's used to the boys partying, so he wants to go and have a look and see what they're doing, because he's an agent. He's got to kind of look after these people and make sure nothing bad's happening. And he gets around the corner and he sees all the guys from the power plant are sitting in the bar laughing and joking. Now, these guys have been on TV for 5 or 6 weeks, and as far as they're concerned, they're stars. But for Arn, the one thing that kind of grabbed him was not the fact that these guys were all sitting in the bar breaking kayfabe, and some of them have maybe been feuding on TV and they're sitting together. That didn't bother him. And maybe it did, but not as much as the fact that you have all these wrestlers sat in a bar. There's no girls, there's no fans, nothing. This is the MGM Grand. This is not a private bar. They're not being mobbed. Nobody's asking for autographs. And that's when he knew nobody gave a crap about the stars in WCW. And for me, that speaks more than any story about WCW's financials. It speaks more than any story about the attitude of Bill Goldberg or Scott Steiner or the issues of Vince Russo. Nobody cared about the talent that were there. And Vince Russo wasn't the one that sent talent home all the time. These decisions were being made by the higher ups to try and save money. So it's quite interesting to see that these things are happening. Now, let's move on to one last story before we move on to talking to our guest today. If you haven't been tuned in from the start, Bradley Craig of the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame is our guest, and he will be on very, very soon. But not to try and put our guest together with this, but Rob Van Dam and Matt Seidel were in High Times magazine talking about smoking weed. One of the things that's quite interesting, if you don't know the story, Rob Van Dam wasn't a weed smoker, and then inspired by certain people on the ECW roster, he gave it a try, realized he liked it, which is fine. But it didn't really become part of his character until he saw an RVD 420 sign in ECW, and he thought, yeah, do you know what? I'd love to be the poster boy for weed because I love it. Now, that's the interesting thing about ECW. A lot of the things there were organic, and a lot of talent really did take their ideas from what was going on. And that's why it's interesting when you look at the role that RVD had in WWE. They didn't necessarily want to stop him smoking weed, and there were some references and jokes to it by JR over the years. But it's his comments on how Stephanie McMahon treated it that are quite interesting. I'm going to quote Rob Van Dam. And he said that Stephanie McMahon said to him, look, if you're going to get high, at least be discreet about it. They didn't care. He could still perform. And I think in many ways, the WWE's drug testing policy has really, really stepped up in some ways and prevented people from getting hurt, prevented people from becoming addicted to certain drugs. There are, however, some people who have been on the other side of it, where it's actually been detrimental. Now, Matt Seidel speaks about the fact that when he was in developmental, testing for marijuana and weed and whatever else you want to call these drugs was becoming very high. But these drugs can actually, in many ways, be a pain reliever. So Matt Seidel actually says that he was ostracized because he smoked pot. But one of the issues was it did lead to him actually taking other drugs as well, because he wasn't able to take the thing that he was using as his natural painkiller. So it's quite an interesting topic to look at, and that's drugs in wrestling. I think in some ways we've stepped towards the positives of, we don't have the Eddie Guerreros, we don't have the Kurt Hennigs and all these people who are suffering from drug addiction, and it's damaging them and damaging their body. But we are also getting to the point now where there are certain things that are legal. There are cannabis oil and various other products that perhaps are something that the WWE should perhaps look into. They are a natural pain reliever that I know members of my family have used, not something that I've used, but I know if I was in enough pain, I would probably try it. So it'd be interesting to see if the WWE's wellness policy allows for things like cannabis oil and its derivatives. So a few weeks ago, I was approached by Bradley Craig on Twitter. We had a very nice conversation. And what was really interesting was he actually said he was available for interviews. And I pounced on this. Bradley Craig, the founder and controller of the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame. Not just the founder and controller of the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame, but also a wrestling historian who has written for the Pro Wrestling Torch and has written the biography of Jeannie Clark. Jeannie Clark, a person you may know as the ex-wife of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, we had so much content. We had probably 2 shows worth of content. And we decided, instead of putting it all on today, what we're going to do is we're going to split it into 2. So this week, you're going to get the interview with Bradley about the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame. And next week, we're going to do an interview about Jeannie Clark and her biography. Both slightly different, but we do see in both interviews the passion that Bradley Craig has for the wrestling business. And I do want to put across one thing, and I'm going to hold Bradley to this. He said before we ended the Skype call, if I was interested in doing a show on WCW, which is one of his favorite things, then he's more than up for it. And you know what, Bradley? When you see this, I want you to know I'm definitely up for doing a WCW show, because you know what? I had so much fun doing that interview, not only because of the stuff that we're going to be able to air, but for the stuff that we're able to speak about off the air. If you are looking for a guest for your show, Bradley Craig, a wrestling historian, he is somebody who is so knowledgeable about not just wrestling in general, but specifically Scottish wrestling. Now, I tried to find out who was going to be in the Wrestling Hall of Fame this year. I played nice, but I tried to see if he would let things slip. But he did give me a name for somebody he thinks should be in the Hall of Fame. So let's get watching the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame founder, Bradley Craig, as he spoke to Headlocks and Headphones. Okay, so before we get on with the interview, just tell us a bit about yourself. So what is it that you do away from the wrestling world?
Okay, so away from wrestling, I'm actually an architect. So I am mostly involved in design and refurbishment of buildings, extensions, all that kind of stuff, steading conversions, all levels of architecture. So design was something that I was interested in from quite an early age, as well as obviously pro wrestling and things like that. But no, I've always been interested in design and writing and things of that nature as well.
It's not what a profession that you expect somebody who's a wrestling fan to be into. I mean, the perception of a wrestling fan is usually not as well educated. Hopefully, I'm going to be continuing that trend, seeing as I'm in the fourth year of my master's in politics. So hopefully, wrestling fans are getting smarter, which can never be a bad thing. So
I think wrestling fans come from quite a varied background.
I think a lot of it's to do with perception, sadly. I mean, there's particularly if you look at advertisers in America, there's a perception that, you know, it's the low rent people who watch wrestling. But from what I'm seeing, there's quite a lot of people out there with high intelligence, and even sports stars who are going out there and they actually are huge fans of what they're seeing in wrestling. So that brings me to, what was your first wrestling memory? And was it British or was it American?
My first actual wrestling memory would be British wrestling, and it was always on a Saturday afternoon during the kind of dying days of World of Sport.
So what year would you put as being your first wrestling memory?
Around 1984.
What? So the year I was born.
Yeah.
So when it comes to when you turned on the TV, what was the first thing you saw when you saw British wrestling?
Well, I was like an infant of the 80s, a child of the 80s. So when I was growing up, I was always interested in all these kind of like tough guys, whether it was Batman or He-Man or Rambo or Rocky, that would have like a score to settle, and they would settle it in some kind of physical conflict. And to me, pro wrestling almost was the embodiment of that. It was like a good movie, but without the garbage and the weight of a plot. Because when you're a child, you don't want to suffer through some 90 minutes of plot for a fight. You just want to see the action happen. And pro wrestling was a real outlet for that.
So earlier on, when we were discussing things, you sent me an article about how British wrestling changed as ITV stepped away from showing British wrestling and moved into American wrestling. Have you become a fan of the American product as well?
Yes, it was actually watching WCW every week on ITV which made me like going from just being a fan to a super fan. Because I think that British wrestling was presented, apart from Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks and a couple of characters like Catweasel and guys like that, generally it was presented very straight-laced as a sport with some characters, but it was really the characters of American wrestling which made me feel in love with it, because you felt like you could really rally behind some of the athletes that were presented there, and also you got to find out more of their personalities through things like in-ring promos, backstage promos, things that angles that happened to create storylines. That was never something that really was in British wrestling. It was just standalone matches.
Do you
which
think that's something that's lost? I mean, part of the charm of the world of sport is the fact that it's not as
Mhm.
glamorous as the American product. Do you think that as the British product has modernized, do you think it's tried to become too American? Do you think
I think
that's maybe been a problem?
I, I think that there's almost a market for every single type of product out there. So there probably is a gap in the market for something that's maybe catering to the British traditional system. But the difficulty is that the way that the matches were presented, I don't know how many of today's wrestlers can work that style, because it's a completely different type of psychology in
Yeah.
working a match that's set over several rounds. Because
There was one company down in England, was it LDN Wrestling? They
Mhm,
attempted it, and it was relatively short lived.
mhm.
So I mean,
Which
it's a shame. I know I'm a fan of the world of sports stuff. I mean, on my computer, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I have probably about 200 episodes
Mhm,
of world of sport wrestling, and
mhm.
the wife has regularly woke up at 3 in the morning to hear, that famous theme song. So
Yeah.
it does. I mean, for me, this is probably not the best time to mention his name, but the Jack Gallagher character that featured on NXT and 205 and everything, that was somebody that I really got behind, because it was
Mhm.
almost, it wasn't exactly the same, but you could kind of see the traditional British wrestling in there, which I liked.
No, he was completely a throwback to the old style, because if you actually, I don't know how many people would notice this, but his striped trunks that he wore, they were an homage to Jackie Pallo.
Oh yeah.
He was trained by Marty Jones, who was one of the best British wrestlers of the glory days of the World of Sport era. And a lot of his style was completely in the kind of vein of a George Kidd or a Jim Breaks, in terms of the chain mat wrestling that they would do with the, almost, it was based on escapology and transition holds and counters, etc. So he was very much almost a modern day proponent of the kind of traditional British wrestling style.
I mean, that escapology style that you mentioned there, when Johnny Saint went over to Shikara and had matches that involved Colt Cabana and Mike Quackenbush,
Hmm.
I've shown them. My wife's 10 years younger, so she fits into that demographic, almost like the MTV culture is skipped her by, where she kind of wants everything in bite-sized chunks. But she
Hmm.
sat and watched that, and she was like, "This is actually, if this happened on TV every week, you'd probably be entertained by it,
Hmm.
especially." You could see it's almost I don't want to swear too much, but it's almost like a pissing contest between two guys,
Hmm.
and I personally love that. I've seen it live a couple of times here, when WWE were in Aberdeen and Jack Gallagher was here. He did that kind of thing, so it definitely, the fans like it live. It's whether it translates as well on TV is perhaps a different thing. Now, moving on from the British wrestling style, the influence of Scottish wrestlers. So
Hmm.
when and why was the Scottish Wrestling Hall of Fame set up?
Okay, I basically started writing on British wrestling history and talking to a lot of the veterans of that era, guys like Marty Jones, Johnny Saint, even locally guys like Len Ironside, etc. And one of the things that always bothered me was that with the whole resurgence of British wrestling, and especially the scene in Scotland, everyone in Scotland would know the likes of a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels, or even as far back as Lou Thez. People in this country know the history of American wrestling, but they didn't know the actual history of wrestling that had occurred in their own backyard. And I actually almost thought that there was a whole industry with a rich heritage, and that history had been forgotten about, almost swept under the carpet, because of the fact that the WWE and WCW, etc., had such a kind of cultural foothold in our country, which, is just because they're these mass media marketing, powerhouses. They were almost able to assimilate our culture. And to me, there was a real kind of, I just went on almost a mission of trying to preserve as much history and celebrate as much history, and almost reintroduce some of the legends of yesteryear to today's audience, because I didn't want the efforts of these great athletes from yesteryear being forgotten about.
So is that something that you want to actually pursue down the line in terms of, you're talking about maintaining the history.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to, because we will talk later on about you and your writing, is that something that you want to get involved with in terms of actually putting stuff out there that people can read, people can watch, to find out the history of Scottish wrestling?
Yes, I mean, everything that the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame for Scotland has done has been public domain information. So when I started the Hall of Fame, the first thing I wanted to do was to put plaques in public buildings which the public could visit and see, and it would be of no cost to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to make this as accessible a Hall of Fame as possible. This isn't some marketing ploy that's going to generate income for a commodity. This is something that's done as a labor of love, and it's to salvage some kind of history and present it out there to the public, and also engage the local press, national press, the provosts of each town for each induction, so that we could get some kind of, basically a spotlight on the efforts of these great athletes of yesteryear, present their careers to a modern audience, and also try and make it relevant to today's fan base. So if, for example, if you have an athlete that is similar to an athlete of today, you can maybe in the media interviews draw comparisons to who they would have been the equivalent of, so that the modern audience can kind of relate to them. So if I say that George Kidd was this great, a chain wrestler, a mat wrestler, you can draw comparisons to the likes of a Dean Malenko or a Bret Hart or one of these fantastic technical wrestlers, the likes of an Andy Robin, for example. He had a good fundamental technical wrestling prowess, but he was more of a power brawler. So with the technical wrestling and the brawling style, I almost make him somewhat similar to likes of a Stone Cold Steve Austin when he changed his style around 1998 and become like this power brawler, but he also had the solid mat skills. So likes of him, and if you think about the likes of a Chick Cullen was almost a maverick, high flyer or fast, technical wrestler, similar to an Owen Hart or a Brian Pillman in terms of the style that he wrestled.
So one of the things I found quite interesting is you look around at Hall of Fames, and what they want to try and do is they want to try and get as many people on there as they can to kind of generate some interest. You've been quite stern with the idea that you're only going to have one induction per year. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me why that's the case?
It's all to do with the fact that I'm really concerned about the sustainability of this Hall of Fame. I didn't want to basically, put everything out there in the first year and then you've got nowhere to go. I want this to be an ongoing tradition. And I also was conscious of the fact that I didn't want to water down the Hall of Fame to just be a case of everyone that wrestled in the past goes in. Because what happens is if you put in 5 people in the first year, then who do you put in the second year? And then in the third, then you're starting to really water it down once you get to about 20 people.
Somebody who wrestled one show once in Scotland becomes Hall of Famer, yeah.
And so also the fact is that, there's only so many people in Scottish wrestling history. We've got quite I don't want to say we have a narrow talent pool, because at one point we did have hundreds of wrestlers up and down the country. But in terms of people that really became to the point where you have to be considered a Hall of Famer in terms of the attributes of being a robust crowd draw, a great in-ring performer, a memorable character outside the ring, and someone that actually enhanced the perception of pro wrestling. To be all 4 of these attributes really takes a special kind of person. Otherwise, you're just throwing in people for the sake of it. And I didn't want to follow some other Hall of Fames where they've put people in that are quite questionable choices just on the idea of marketing.
Yeah, DVD. Yeah. So is it just yourself that actually is in charge of making the decision of who goes in, or do you have people who kind of you go to for advice and
Every single former Hall of Famer that's been inducted so far, or their family, has been involved in the selection process. So the likes of Chick Cullen, Andy Robin, and his wife Maggie, the family of George Kidd, etc., Bill Ross, they're all involved in the selection process. Ultimately, I do make the final decision
yeah.
regarding that, and a lot of it is based on as well a lot of historical research that I do. Involved in I provide historical information to the likes of Wrestling Observer and a lot of the publications as well for pro wrestling. So a lot of it is based on quite meticulous research on who deserves to go in, and by basically going through newspaper archives and also historic wrestling magazines, going through old attendance figures as well as results, because it's the word legend is something that's really bandied about so much now that it's almost become a watered down word. And to me, I want to differentiate between the modern usage of the word legend and what I would deem a Hall of Famer.
It's interesting you mentioned newspapers and stuff. So, but there was a point where wrestling was still being reported in the sports section, not in the way that we see. I mean, we're based in Aberdeen. There's a local company that is involved, but it is still almost like a nod and a wink. Everybody's kind of in on it. But back in the day, there was a point where wrestling was reported in the news section alongside football and darts and rugby. Do you think that stepping away from the perception of a quote unquote real sportsman has actually kind of had a negative impact on the business, or do you think it's allowed it to almost modernize?
I think that if you're talking about the era of kayfabe, I don't really think that people knowing the inner workings of wrestling has necessarily impacted it for the worst. I think what's happened is the mainstream appeal of wrestling diminished, so its mainstream coverage diminished as a result. If you look at the era of, say, George Kidd in the 1940s, there were times where he was on the front cover of certain newspapers and magazines because the crowds he was drawing, Paisley Ice Rink, every time he wrestled there for a few years, he was every few weeks drawing 6,000 people to Paisley.
If anybody do that today, with the bigger populations, you'd be thinking, wow, that's amazing. But shows today are drawing 200, 300 people, and that's a good amount.
So that's a big show for today's standard.
Yeah, I mean, that's scary. So it started in 2014, which led to your first induction of George Kidd in 2015.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go through them one by one. And if you kind of have like an interesting story about each one, that'd be really cool for us to share with the people who are hopefully going to see this once we share it. So George Kidd in 2015. Do you want to explain why he was put in and what impact he had on the Scottish scene?
Okay, so in terms of George Kidd, there was never any question that he would be the first inductee. When you think of a wrestler that embodied everything that makes a great professional wrestler, he was it. In terms of, there was never a bigger crowd draw in Scotland than George Kidd. In fact, Kent Walton, who was the legendary commentator of the World of Sport era, always would refer to George Kidd as the best he had ever seen. And when you hear that from someone that had commentated on British wrestling for 30 years, that's a person with a lot of credibility to the name too.
Especially the amount of Hall of Famers that have actually featured on those shows as well.
Yeah, and not only just in terms of the British system, but there were so many great American stars like Ricky Starr, Peter Maivia, even the likes of Andre the Giant, who came and wrestled as Giant Ferrer. So Kent Walton saw them all in terms of British wrestling, in terms of imports, export, etc. he saw so many wrestlers at the peak of their careers during the heyday of British wrestling. So when he said that guy's the best, that's some fair praise.
And it's
But
it's a high standard to set for your first induction as well.
that's right. But also, almost every single professional wrestler from the glory days of wrestling that I spoke to when I was going through the selection process, so many of them said George Kidd has to be the one, because to me he was and when I say to me, I'm paraphrasing them, they all these wrestlers said that he was the finest in-ring performer that they'd ever seen. So, he really was the first wrestler to try and make chain mat wrestling an entertaining form of competition. He effectively invented that Johnny Saint style,
which is really interesting. I'm a massive fan of Johnny Saint, so to hear that there's a Scottish influence there is actually really cool.
The other thing is that Johnny Saint actually wrestled a completely different style until 1976. Yeah, so
I mean, I'm giving away the fact that my British wrestling knowledge it basically is fairly mainstream, unfortunately.
but the thing is, I'm always learning, always, every single day. The more I do some research on British wrestling, I'm learning more and more and more. So every single day, I'm in a different place than I was yesterday in terms of British wrestling. So Johnny Saint actually used to wrestle a certain style, which was a completely different style than what he became famous for. When George Kidd retired in 1976, promoter Max Crabtree asked Johnny Saint to adopt the George Kidd style.
Which is I've watched a lot of interviews with people like Jim Cornette and several other wrestlers from America, and they've been very high on Johnny Saint as being a massive influence. Mike Quackenbush from Shikara, and there's several others. So to hear that he's essentially not copying, but heavily influenced by George Kidd is remarkable to know. I mean, the amount of wrestlers, even Colt Cabana, who just springs to mind as well, and the roots of that are all Scottish.
Yes.
Now, move on to 2016, and the inductee was Andy Robin.
But just before we move on to him, the other thing I wanted to mention about George Kidd, he became, not only was he a great wrestler, he was this huge mainstream star. In 1965, he was Grampian Television Personality of the Year, and he had 3 television shows that were broadcast nationally as well. So he was like a talk show host because of his fame. He had a show called The George Kidd Show that was on every week and had guests like Lulu and local comedians as well. So he was this huge mainstream star. He had columns in the newspaper where he would cover pro wrestling. He had, he was often featured on the cover of the TV Times, which was no small deal for a pro wrestler from Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, and I thought just having the impact on wrestling would be huge, but to know the impact he's had in the mainstream is cool. So, Andy Robin 2016, what were the reasons behind inducting Andy Robin?
Okay, for a generation, Andy Robin was Scottish wrestling from basically the 70s right through to the 80s to the early 90s. Andy Robin was basically the man when it came to being a crowd draw. And I'm not talking about necessarily the work with Hercules the Bear, which was a completely different thing and was on a huge level of celebrity that is hard to even fathom these days. Because at one point, if you talk to someone about someone being a huge TV star, nowadays when you think of a TV star, the fame lasts 15 minutes, because there's so many options in terms of entertainment, how many channels we have these days, etc. Andy Robin was a huge star during a time period when television exposure was really hard to get, and he got so much of it because people just gravitated towards his personality, which was just huge, larger than life lumberjack character. He really made a niche for himself by going overseas. He was a tremendous athlete that was involved in Highland Games. So he participated in so many different diverse events, such as track and field athletics, He was involved in, what we call Scottish backhold wrestling, which is a kind of form of, I don't want to describe it as sumo, but it's like a kind of Celtic sport where you're involved in, like, you almost start off in a bear hug position, and the idea is to throw your man over. He was also involved in hammer throw and feats of strength and all this kind of stuff, tossing caber, all that kind of stuff. He then went to Canada and was part of a touring attraction where they would exhibit Highland Games events to a new audience. It was part of a touring attraction. It was during that time that the Tunnies, Frank Tunney and Jack, they said, if you want to be a part of our touring wrestling promotion based in Toronto, we'd love to have you, because there's great opportunities for fantastic athletes like yourself, and you've got a larger than life charisma, etc. So he became this overnight sensation in terms of wrestling in Canada. He won a very prestigious Tournament of Champions in 1964 in Canada, and with it became the British Commonwealth champion. And he took that gold back when he came home to Scotland, and became one of the top stars in what was Joint Promotions, the dominant body in professional wrestling in the UK.
How much training did he have when he was propositioned by the Tunnies? So, was he a trained wrestler, or was it something he just kind of learned as he went?
A lot of the wrestlers at one point just kind of learned in the ring. What would happen is, most of the wrestlers, when they would start, they had strong amateur credentials, and then they would get the opportunity to work with a guy who was, a lot of times when they put in a novice wrestler who didn't know how wrestling worked, they would put them in with these super shooter wrestlers who would be able to take care of themselves and just see what the guys had when they were starting. And it was just to make sure that whoever was entering the business had a respect for that business. So, and they didn't want the business being exposed in terms of, the worst thing for pro wrestling would be for someone to think that the business was easy to get into and was a game that anyone could do. They didn't want that. So the strong amateur credentials of Andy Robin allowed him to get quite a good foothold into the business, and also hold, he did a strong showing in his first few matches before he gradually became aware of the fact that there was an entertainment aspect to the business.
So when we look at somebody like, moving on to 2017, Chick Cullen, that's what I know him as. I actually previously had been at some wrestling training sessions with Len Ironside, and Len would actually tell us how much he enjoyed both working with and the company of Chick Cullen. Mm-hmm. But give us some information about Frank Cullen and why he was inducted in 2017.
Chick Cullen, in some ways similar to Andy Robin, both come from Stirling, and both made great careers in terms of both on either side of the Atlantic. Chick did the kind of opposite tour of Andy Robin, where he started in the UK and then went to Canada. So, such an influential career.
He lives in Canada now, doesn't he? Frank Cullen lives in Canada now, doesn't he? Because I constantly see, I have him on Twitter, and I constantly see the amount of modern wrestlers, or perhaps slightly a generation back, who have him on Twitter and actually interact with him. So he's somebody who, a lot like some other guys like Dave Taylor, who maybe are not considered up as popular as The Rock or anything, but certainly popular with the boys that they would have done shows with. Mm-hmm. So, any interesting stories about Frank? Because what I've heard is that he can be the best worker when he wants to be, but if he's grumpy, he can be quite stern with people he's in the ring with.
Okay, well, having never wrestled myself, I can't comment on what he's like when he's grumpy, but I just know that when I look back on the career of Frank Cullen, I see someone that was part of a generation of guys such as Marty Jones, Rollerball Rocco, Dave Finlay, etc., that redefined what a great worker was in the middleweight ranks. There were, during a time period where all of the marketing was placed on the super heavyweights, the likes of Haystacks and Daddy and guys like that. Marte Jones and Finlay and Chick Cullen were really the class of wrestlers that had the wrestling fans coming back, because they put on these superlative matches that just changed the game for pro wrestling, and also had an influence on not only the UK scene, but on the American scene later on with the cruiserweight division.
You can definitely see the influence that these mid-80s talents had, especially when I showed my wife the Dynamite Kid Tiger Mask, and I can't remember which one of the matches it was. She thought it was sped up. That's how impressive the work was. And when you look at some of the modern guys like the Young Bucks and people like that, you can see that influence where it's clear that the performance is more than just going in and making things look like they hurt. It's also about giving people something they can go away. Did you see that? I have to go and see it next time. Or didn't see it live. I have to see it. A lot of the highlight videos from people like Rollerball Rocco is stuff that holds up today when you compare it to the videos that are being produced by WWE. The production quality is maybe not the same, but the move quality is probably even executed better than some of the people that are doing it today.
And of course, Rollerball Rocco as well was you mentioned Tiger Mask. Rollerball Rocco was actually in New Japan Pro Wrestling to be the nemesis of Tiger Mask. He put on a mask himself and was the Black Tiger character,
which is insane to think the amount of people that worked with Tiger Mask. I mean, speaking again about Len Ironside, the stories he told about working a show in Inverurie with Sammy Lee, who wanted to be Tiger Mask, and you're just thinking, this is insane. And then when you go and you read, and Japan used to send people on excursions all the time, so there's probably quite a few huge names that wrestled in Aberdeen or Inverurie or small towns in Scotland in front of 150, 200 people, and it's insane to think that these people were enjoying working with Len Ironside and talents like that. So we move into 2018, and Bill Ross was the inductee.
Yep. Bill Ross is a person with fantastic amateur credentials as well as great professional wrestling credentials. He was one of the superlative lightweight wrestlers from the 60s and 70s. His career ended in 1981, but he was just this real robust wrestler with tremendous credibility, often featured at the top of cards up and down the country, and was part of a very formidable tag team as well called the Flying Scots. But when you look at the career of a Bill Ross, he was just a robust draw and had a storied career laced with gold, in terms of he was a multi-time British lightweight champion, he was European lightweight champion, British Commonwealth lightweight champion, and then he changed his diet and started packing on the pounds and faced Adrian Street in the Music Hall for the middleweight title, won that belt, and retired undefeated as the European middleweight champion. So
I mean, that's one thing that's a part of the World of Sport style that's often forgotten about, is that everything was done as weight classes. And thankfully with the British style, we don't kind of always place the bigger at the top of the card. I mean, yeah, obviously the World of Sport TV program placed Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy at the top, but a lot of the wrestlers we've mentioned, Rollerball Rocco, who's not a small guy, but definitely not a Big Daddy or Giant Haystacks. Thankfully, the weight classes allowed British wrestling, at least in some way, to place people at the top of their division and come over as stars, whether or not they were the biggest guy, which I certainly... I don't watch wrestling for the big guys. That's something that's really annoying me about a certain American promoter who's in his 70s, is his reliance on big guys who just... I've tuned in to watch wrestling. If I want to watch big guys running around, I can watch, Titan Games with The Rock, or I can watch those kind of things. And that's something that I think is really missing from wrestling in America, is the smaller guys. But in saying that, we move on to 2019's induction, Drew
Hmm.
McDonald, who is
Hmm.
by no means a small guy.
Well, Drew McDonald's Hall of Fame career is twofold, because it's partly because of the fact that he was the super heavyweight champion in terms of his size and his brawn, etc. He was thrown in at the deep end in terms of when he started wrestling. He was almost instantly in those big matches with Big Daddy and Haystacks, etc. So he made such a splash early on in his career in terms of how many guys in their second year in the business are featured in FA Cup final day big matches, with Big Daddy and Haystacks, and
I mean, that's something that I can't even imagine on FA Cup day being able to sit and watch a wrestling show as well. I mean, I'm a massive, I mean, as you can tell, I'm a bit of a football fan, bit of a wrestling fan. So being able to sit and watch both on the same day would be very cool. So to know that essentially every person who had a TV set was sitting watching the wrestling and the FA Cup is just insane. I mean, there's so many, like you said earlier, so many options today that we kind of step away from that. Now, Drew didn't just have a wrestling career, though. He also was in charge of his own wrestling promotion for a while as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So his impact will have been felt way beyond the stuff that he did in the ring, and his influence will have been huge. But this is the part where obviously we don't want to ignore the things that are happening in the real world. So has the pandemic changed plans for an induction this year?
It hasn't changed plans; it's just delayed them. We are still planning on having an induction in 2020.
So is that going to be when things ease off and you can have basically unveil the back and stuff? So you already have that person in mind for
Hmm.
who's going in.
Hmm.
So if we were to, obviously, I don't want you to give it away now because I know you're going to have a big reveal for when that comes. But can you give some names of people that down the line would certainly be, to use a Jim Ross phrase, to be in the hunt for going in the Hall of Fame in the future?
Okay, I mean, in terms of like names of the past,
Yeah.
certain people that spring to mind would be the likes of a Donald Dinny. Now, people probably don't know who Donald Dinny is. Donald Dinny was a 19th century athlete who was a strong man and a superlative athlete in almost he won competitions in almost every athletic endeavor that he did, and he was also involved in, when I say professional wrestling matches, fighting for money, almost like UFC style. But he became some of his matches, it seems, were done for a little bit of entertainment value as well. So he's almost like a pioneer of pro wrestling in this country.
It's amazing to think that it goes back that far because when you read the American wrestling history, it almost kind of starts around about 1920s, 1930s,
Hmm.
and obviously you have the foundation of the NWA.
Hmm.
And you look and hear that this kind of thing was happening as far back as it was is just insane. So that's a nice thing to have. We have a name of somebody that is potentially going to go in, and I know that if I start pressing you a little too much, you might end up giving me the name for who's going in. So, do you have any links with other Hall of Fames around the world?
We certainly have had communications with the likes of the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, which is going to be set up in New York. We have discussions often with the Iowa Hall of Fame, the one in Texas as well, which has its own physical museum. In terms of what we're looking to do there is donate some of our plaques or make replicas of our plaques and put them on display there. I'm also involved in the Cauliflower Alley Club.
Okay, with Brian Blair and
Mm-hmm.
is Brian still involved? Because
Brian's the president, yeah.
yeah, there was something that happened a few months ago. Somebody resigned, so I just wanted to make sure it wasn't Brian because I have a Brian Blair mask on my wall because um, every time I watch the Killer Bees, it's a team that would have like when I started watching wrestling, the Killer Bees would have been huge. So to know that in the 80s they were almost kind of, especially in WWF, treated almost as secondary, and it's weird to see. So before we finish talking about the Hall of Fame, I want to ask your opinion of the modern Scottish scene. Now, obviously, I don't want to go into everything that happened a couple of weeks ago in terms of those stories. So let's think about the positives, even if there are negatives. Let's look at the positives of what you think of the present day Scottish wrestling scene.
Okay. In terms of the present day wrestling, I'm just so impressed with so many of the athletes, how they've been able to rebuild the industry from the ground up. Because unlike the American wrestling scene, which has always had a continuous stream of, passing the torch and succession of athletes, in terms of knowledge transfer, etc. The domestic wrestling scene collapsed here in the 1990s. It just died, absolutely died a death.
The only company I remember as a young kid, so it would have been '93.
Mm-hmm.
The only company I knew of that were even doing anything was All Star,
Mm-hmm.
and they were the ones who in '93 brought over British Bulldog. Maybe '94, just after he left WCW, brought over British Bulldog, and then later would bring over Jake the Snake and Yokozuna. But there was seemingly no local wrestling in Scotland, and certainly the companies that existed down in England tended to be the FWAs, who were designed to bring over American talents, which seemed to not really help what was happening here. Who in the present Scottish wrestling scene do you look at and think, okay, maybe not yet, but if your career continues as it is, you're somebody that would be worthy down the line for the Hall of Fame?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, you just had to watch WrestleMania this year to figure out who would be a first ballot choice. Also, you look at an athlete like a Joe Henry, for example. He's got so much potential that if he continues on the path that he's been going on, it'd be.
And not the fact that he's also a legitimate athlete as well, who's represented his country. It's just
Mm-hmm.
an insane thing to think about, and to see how entertaining he is as well with his entrance videos. It's something that I think was sorely missing for a while, is the ability to just poke fun at wrestling whilst also make, as soon as you get in the ring, it can be quite serious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, it's hard to see past somebody like Drew McIntyre. Met him once in a bar here in Aberdeen, and I can honestly say the guy, as soon as he walks in a room, it's, everybody talks about that thing about Hulk Hogan. When he walks in a room, everybody pays attention to him. And Alberto Del Rio walked in the room, and then Drew McIntyre walked in the room, and everybody gravitated to Drew, even though Alberto Del Rio is at the time seemingly a bigger star. There's just something about him, and um, I think sometimes failure actually spurs people on. So I think Drew is now probably got the passion that he maybe lost a little bit a few years ago. So there we go. I had 2 hours with Bradley Craig, and I just want to say that it was an incredible evening. And one of the things that's quite interesting, people don't understand this. For a wrestling geek to sit and talk wrestling with somebody else is great. To be able to tell somebody else the knowledge that you have, and I do that regularly because I think I have a reasonable amount of knowledge. And my knowledge pales in comparison to Bradley Craig's. And I know it's not competition. Bradley's not going to be going out wearing a t-shirt saying I'm smarter than Martin Anderson, although I'm sure several people probably will be. But what fills me with happiness, if there's one great thing we can take from lockdown, it's that it seems a little bit easier to talk to people just now. I'm somebody who doesn't want to speak to people on a normal day. I just go out of my way to avoid it, despite what people might think about how I act away from recording these videos. These videos have been absolutely amazing for keeping me focused on doing something during this lockdown. I just want to say one thing, that when it comes to recording videos on YouTube, usually it's just me and my wife, and often we do them together. Sometimes we're recording things apart. Sometimes I record things on my own. But the important part has been that the show essentially has been getting done together, and it's been something to keep us both a little bit occupied and give us something to do. So even if we're having a really busy week, we know we have to set aside time for the show. So to know that Bradley's set aside time for doing this was absolutely amazing. If you enjoyed the interview, give us a like, follow us on Facebook. Hopefully we're going to have more coming up, particularly that WCW episode that Bradley's promised me. We are going to get that done. I do want to do a deep dive on something related to WCW. But before that gets done, we do already have the interview about writing Jeannie Clark's biography. That's going to be on next week's show, where we will see the return of Zoe Styles, and I believe that we have some more videos from Stuart Murphy and JJ Andrews. Not entirely sure what the hell's happening with those two, but they will be back on next week as well. And we will actually cover Raw, SmackDown, NXT, and AEW next week. I know we're a wrestling show, but I just felt this week, giving our time to the wrestling historian was probably going to be more productive. I want to leave you with one thought. That new belt that they've just revealed on Monday Night Raw is not the greatest. Let's be fair. It's not the best belt in the world. And it's one of those things that, as a belt collector with over 30 belts, and most of them are the replica belts. They're not customs. I have one custom belt, which is a Zelda one. But we have over 30 belts in this house, and we love every belt for a different reason. Even the ones we don't like the design of, there's a story behind them. One of which I'll tell you now because I think it's quite interesting. So last Christmas, I bought the wife, the producer, Zoe Styles, the WWE 24/7 title. And said to my mum, who that's where we were going for Christmas, so what I want you to do is put a referee top on her kid, and I want you to count 1, 2, 3 when I pin Zoe Styles. So when Zoe received her Christmas presents, the last one was a messenger bag. And she was like, oh, cool, a messenger bag. I said, well, look inside it. When she opened it up, as soon as she put her hand on the belt, I pulled her legs out from under her, rolled her up for a pin, and my mum counted 1, 2, 3. I just want to point out, that makes me the longest reigning WWE 24/7 champion. Because as of 7 minutes past 3 on the 10th of July, 2020, she's yet to win it back. Anyway, the new US title design, not a big fan of it. However, the quality of that belt production is amazing. They're using a brand new 3D type of belt making, which is going to start producing some incredible designs, and it's going to be really hard for people to bootleg. But if you've seen the replicas, they are hollow. If you're not sure what the hollow design actually is, what I will do is I'll pop the picture up now so you can see what the hollow design actually is. So the first picture was the replica belt. The second picture is the main plate taken off, so you can see behind it, to reveal that it's hollow, unlike the actual title, which is 3D print version. The quality is incredible of the real belt. The replicas were never going to be as good, and that's one of those things in wrestling. Sometimes they produce things that are so good on TV that people are only going to be disappointed with the finished product. It's growing on me. It's absolutely growing on me. The reason I bring this up is because next week on the show, Zoe Styles will be discussing her favorite 3 belts. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'm going to give you my 3 favorite belts. 3 is the WWF tag title, the one held by the Hart Foundation, Axe and Smash, Demolition, those guys. The second one is the NWA TV title with the red leather backing, great belt. And in at number 1, the Winged Eagle. Let's see how much of my list agrees with Sammy's list. She's Zoe, says Sammy. We all know it's the same person. Zoe Styles is my wife, Sammy. One of the things that is going to be interesting next week is we're going to find out from Bradley about the biography of Jeannie Clark. We're going to find out the top 3 belts for Zoe Styles. And, of course, Raw, SmackDown, and NXT. Enough of me rambling. Let's get this in the finishing machine and get this up on YouTube, and we will see you next week for hopefully another entertaining Headlocks and Headphones!